40 miles from the nearest outpost, beneath the merciless Arizona sun, Jabez Thorne discovered two dying Apache warrior women near his failing well, and the choice he made in the next 3 minutes would bind his fate to theirs forever. These were not ordinary women, standing nearly 7 feet tall, their massive forms adorned with the intricate beadwork reserved only for high-born clan daughters. They represented legends whispered around campfire light throughout the territory. The Ndaua'a warrior giants, trained from birth in ways that made grown men tremble, now lay broken in the dust of his dying ranch. Blood pooled beneath the shorter one, her breathing shallow and labored, while the taller woman's dark eyes found his with a desperation that transcended language and culture. Every survival instinct Thorne possessed screamed the same warning. Helping Apache meant death. The territorial law was iron, the consequences swift and brutal. Yet in that moment, staring into eyes that reflected his own helplessness, his own slow death on this unforgiving land, something shifted. The shared terror, the recognition of two souls clinging to life in a world that wanted them gone, shattered every rule he'd built his survival upon. His hands moved before his mind could stop them, reaching for the wounded giants as thunder rolled across the southern ridge and dust clouds rose on the horizon. The choice was made. There would be no going back. The entrance to his cabin was never built for women who stood taller than doorframes. Thorne and the conscious giant, who carried herself with a warrior's bearing despite her wounds, struggled to maneuver her sister's near 7-foot frame through the narrow opening. Sweat mixed with blood on the packed earth floor as they finally succeeded, laying the wounded one on his only bed. The conscious woman, her movements precise despite obvious pain, began immediately tending to her sister's injuries with practiced efficiency. Through gestures and broken fragments of Spanish, she communicated what Thorne's instincts already confirmed. The wound was deep. The fever would come soon, and they had precious little time. Her name emerged through careful pronunciation. Anaba. Her sister, the one fighting for breath on blood-soaked blankets, was Itza. The names felt sacred on his tongue, words that carried weight beyond their sounds. As Anaba worked, Thorne gathered what meager supplies his failing ranch could offer: clean water from his last good barrel, strips of cotton from his own spare shirt, whiskey that burned going down and would burn worse going in. He watched as those massive hands that could surely snap his neck without effort, moved with surprising gentleness across her sister's fevered skin. The beadwork on their clothing told stories he couldn't read, patterns that spoke of lineage and honor, of a world where women this powerful were treasured and protected. Yet here they lay, hunted and bleeding in a stranger's home. As night fell and the temperature dropped with desert suddenness, Anaba finally met his eyes fully. The look she gave him carried no gratitude, no plea for mercy. Instead, it held something far more dangerous: recognition. She saw in him what he'd seen in her dying sister's gaze, that desperate determination to survive against impossible odds. The understanding passed between them without words. A pact formed in silence and sealed by the risk they now shared. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound that made Anaba's entire body go rigid. Horses, multiple riders approaching from the south, their pace deliberate and purposeful. Through the single window, Thorne counted 5 silhouettes cresting the ridge, their forms painted and armed, moving with the coordination of trained warriors. Anaba's hand found his arm, her grip iron-strong despite her injuries. She spoke a single word he understood: brother. Not her brother. The chief's son. The man whose proposal Itza had refused, sparking a chain of events that led to this moment. The simplicity of it struck Thorne like a physical blow. These legendary warriors, these women worth more than his entire property and everything he'd ever owned, were hunted for the same reason that plagued women everywhere: a man's wounded pride. The approaching riders spread out as they descended, flanking his property with military precision. Their leader, an older warrior whose face bore the lines of countless battles, raised his hand in a gesture that could mean peace or threat depending on the next few moments. The 5 Apache warriors dismounted with practiced synchronization, their painted faces unreadable in the fading light. The elder among them, a man whose silver-streaked hair spoke of wisdom earned through survival, stepped forward. His eyes swept across Thorne's failing ranch, taking in every detail with the assessment of someone who'd tracked prey across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. When he finally spoke, his English carried the careful precision of someone who'd learned the language through necessity rather than choice. He asked if Thorne harbored 2 women. The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications that extended far beyond a simple yes or no. Thorne felt Anaba's presence behind the cabin wall, could sense her coiled tension even through the rough timber. His hand rested near his rifle, 12 rounds loaded and ready, though he knew with absolute certainty that those 12 rounds meant nothing against 5 warriors who'd been training for combat since they could walk. The mathematics of violence were simple and damning. This was not a fight he could win through force. The elder warrior introduced himself as Nijoni, second to Chief Cochise himself, and stated that they sought the chief's daughters who'd fled after refusing a sacred proposal. The words carried weight that transcended their surface meaning. These weren't just any women. They were royalty, and their flight represented a challenge to authority that could destabilize an entire clan structure. Nijoni's gaze never left Thorne's face as he explained the situation with brutal efficiency. The chief's ambitious son had offered for Itza, the younger daughter. She'd refused, an act that would have been her right in peace times but complicated matters given the son's position and influence. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and the son's honor guard had pursued the sisters with orders to bring them back. The confrontation had turned violent near Thorne's property line. Now justice demanded their return. The silence that followed stretched like pulled wire, tight enough to snap. Thorne made his choice, speaking words he couldn't take back. He stated his name clearly, and added that 3 moons prior, he'd pulled Chief Cochise's youngest daughter from Swollen Creek waters, carrying her home safely to her village, without seeking reward or recognition. The transformation in Nijoni's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. The elder warrior's eyes widened fractionally, his posture shifting from aggressive confrontation to something more complex. He turned to his companions, speaking rapid Apache that Thorne couldn't follow, but the tone suggested verification, confirmation of a story that changed everything. Nijoni approached closer, studying Thorne's face with new intensity. He asked why a white settler would risk helping Apache women who'd broken clan law. Thorne's answer came without calculation or strategy, simple truth delivered with the exhaustion of a man who'd stopped caring about consequences. He said they needed help, the same reason he'd helped the chief's daughter, the same reason any decent human being should act when faced with suffering. The words seemed to hang in the desert air, simple and naked in their honesty. Nijoni studied him for a long moment, then delivered his judgment. Chief Cochise would arrive at sunrise to rule on the matter personally. The warriors would make camp at the property's edge, ensuring no one fled during the night. Inside the cabin, Anaba worked frantically over her sister's increasingly fevered form. Itza's massive body shook with chills despite the blankets Thorne piled upon her. The wound, though cleaned and bound, radiated heat that spoke of infection taking hold. Through the long hours of darkness, Thorne and Anaba took turns applying cool cloths to Itza's burning skin, forcing water past her cracked lips, whispering reassurances in their respective languages that probably meant nothing to the unconscious woman, but everything to those keeping vigil. The sound of hoofbeats returned hours before dawn, but these carried a different rhythm, heavier and more numerous than the Apache patrol. Through his window, Thorne recognized the gleam of tin stars catching moonlight. Deputy Marshal William Kane, a man whose reputation for brutal efficiency preceded him like a storm front, led 3 lawmen up the ridge toward his cabin. Behind them trailed 2 civilian riders, likely settlers whose property had suffered recent Apache raids. The timing was catastrophic. Kane dismounted with the confidence of a man who'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through force or intimidation. His eyes swept the property, catching immediately on details that told stories Thorne desperately wished remained unspoken. The massive footprints in the dust, far larger than any white woman's boot, the dark stains on the ground near his well that could only be blood. The Apache warriors camped at his property line like sentinels guarding something precious. When Kane demanded entry, citing investigation of a settler attack 3 miles south, Thorne's mind raced through impossible calculations. Refusing entry meant immediate suspicion. Allowing entry meant discovery and the certain death of both women. The marshal's hand rested on his pistol, not threatening but present, a reminder of the authority he carried and his willingness to use it. Thorne stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him, and began explaining that he'd seen no Apache activity beyond the distant scout party. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, each word a betrayal of the truth that pulsed inside his cabin like a second heartbeat. Kane's expression suggested he didn't believe a single syllable. The marshal pushed past him toward the door, stating his legal right to search any property suspected of harboring fugitives or hostiles. In that moment, with Kane's hand on the door handle and death waiting on both sides of the threshold, Thorne made his confession. He stated that he harbored 2 injured Apache women, both daughters of Chief Cochise, both wounded and fevered, and that he'd given them aid as he would any dying human being regardless of their heritage. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward with consequences he couldn't predict or control. Kane's pistol cleared leather with practiced speed, aimed center mass at Thorne's chest. The marshal's voice carried the cold certainty of a man who'd killed before and would kill again without losing sleep. He stated that aiding hostile Apache was treason against the territory, punishable by immediate execution. The other lawmen spread out, surrounding the cabin, weapons drawn and ready. One moved toward the door, intent on verification and likely violence against whoever he found inside. A call from the ridge interrupted the execution forming before Thorne's eyes. One of the civilian riders, positioned as lookout, shouted warning of more approaching horses from the north, at least 15 riders moving fast and direct toward the property. The Apache warriors at the property edge rose as one, their attention fixed on the new arrivals with recognition rather than alarm. Before Kane could issue new orders, the cabin door opened from within. Anaba emerged first, her 7-foot frame filling the doorway like a goddess carved from living stone. Despite her injuries, despite the exhaustion etched into her features, she carried herself with such regal authority that even the hardened lawman stepped back involuntarily. Behind her came Itza, still weak and leaning heavily on the doorframe, but conscious and fierce-eyed. The sight of the 2 massive warrior women, their beadwork catching the pre-dawn light, their presence commanding respect through sheer physical magnificence, created a moment of stunned silence. Anaba spoke, her English better than Thorne had realized, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the weight of formal ceremony. She declared herself daughter of Chief Cochise, protected by the blood debt owed to Jabez Thorne for saving 3 lives of the chief's family. She invoked the newly signed territorial treaty, negotiated just 2 months prior, which recognized Apache law in matters involving their people, and required consultation with tribal leadership before arrests could be made. The marshal's face purpled with rage, but his hand lowered fractionally from his pistol. Legal complications were the last thing any lawman wanted, especially with a chief's daughters and an approaching Apache contingent. The standoff held, balanced on the edge of violence, as the northern riders crested the ridge and descended toward the cabin with the inevitability of dawn itself. Chief Cochise arrived with the rising sun, accompanied by 5 formal elders whose presence transformed the gathering from a potential massacre into something resembling a court of law. The chief himself was a man whose reputation had been built through decades of strategic brilliance and battlefield prowess, his face bearing the marks of a leader who'd guided his people through impossible choices. He dismounted slowly, his gaze sweeping across the scene with careful assessment, his daughters standing defiant despite their injuries. The white settler positioned protectively between them and the lawman, Nijoni and his warriors flanking the cabin like honor guards. When Cochise finally spoke, his voice carried an authority that silenced even Marshal Kane's bluster. The chief addressed the marshal first, acknowledging the territorial law and the concerns about settler safety, but countering with Apache law and the sacred nature of blood debt. He explained that his daughters had acted in self-defense against his son's honor guard, who'd exceeded their authority and attacked without his permission. The confrontation had been a violation of his orders, making the pursuit itself unlawful under tribal governance. Kane tried to interject, citing 3 dead Apache warriors and 2 wounded settlers as evidence of unprovoked attack. Cochise's response was surgical in its precision. He detailed the timeline, supported by witness testimony from his own warriors who'd tracked the incident, demonstrating that his daughters had been fleeing and only fought when cornered and given no choice. The settlers who'd been injured had attempted to capture the women for bounty, initiating the violence themselves. The legal chess match continued as dawn light spread across the desert, each side maneuvering for advantage, citing treaties and precedents, honor codes and territorial statutes. Through it all, Thorne stood silent, watching a master strategist at work. Cochise's arguments were airtight, his logic unassailable, his presentation flawless. But beneath the legal maneuvering, Thorne sensed something else, a deeper game being played that transcended the immediate crisis. Finally, the chief turned his attention to Thorne himself, asking to confirm the truth of the rescue 3 moons prior. Thorne described finding a young girl, no more than 14 winters, caught in creek waters swollen by upstream rains. He'd pulled her out, wrapped her in his coat, and ridden 6 hours to return her safely to the Apache settlement he'd once traded with in better times. He'd asked for nothing, accepted nothing, and ridden away before dawn to avoid complications. Cochise listened with an expression that revealed nothing, then turned back to the marshal. The chief declared the blood debt valid and binding under both Apache tradition and the treaty's recognition of tribal law. 3 lives saved, 3 lives now protected under his authority. Thorne's ranch, by extension of his actions and the debt owed, would be considered Apache-protected land, granting him immunity from arrest without tribal consultation. The maneuver was brilliant and infuriating in equal measure. Kane had no legal counter that wouldn't violate the treaty and potentially restart hostilities. The marshal's fury was palpable, but he was outmaneuvered and knew it. Through clenched teeth, he acknowledged the chief's authority in this matter and promised to file formal protests with the territorial governor. As the lawmen mounted their horses, defeated but not destroyed, Cochise produced a sacred necklace from beneath his war shirt, the beadwork matching the patterns on his daughter's clothing. With formal ceremony, he placed it around Thorne's neck, declaring him adopted son of the Apache people, granted all rights and protections thereof. The words should have been a victory, a celebration of the life saved and honor upheld. Instead, they fell like a cage closing, beautiful and binding. Thorne felt Anaba's gaze upon him, intense and complicated, as her father proclaimed him family, brother to his daughters, protected son of the tribe. The chief's eyes held knowing amusement as he mounted his horse, as if he could see the invisible chains he'd just forged. Before departing, Cochise delivered his final statement. He would return the following day with a different decision, one that required careful thought through the night. The instruction to consider what adoption truly meant hung in the air like smoke, obscuring meanings Thorne couldn't yet grasp, but Anaba clearly understood. The Apache contingent departed, leaving Najoni and 2 warriors as honor guard, both protection and subtle supervision. Inside the cabin, with Marshal Kane's threat temporarily neutralized and Itzah's fever finally breaking, the true complexity of the situation settled over Thorne like desert heat. He was now legally Apache, bound by traditions he barely understood, adopted into a family that included the 2 women he'd risked everything to save. Brother to Anaba, whose gaze had never once looked at him with sisterly affection. The tension that had been building between them, charge that crackled in the air whenever they moved in the same space, was now forbidden by the very law that had saved their lives. Through the long day that followed, as Itzah regained strength and Anaba tended to the practical matters of recovery, Thorne wrestled with implications he'd been too focused on survival to consider. The attraction between himself and Anaba wasn't one-sided. He'd felt it in every careful touch when she'd helped him lift her sister, in every shared glance during the long night's vigil, in the way she positioned herself between him and danger without hesitation or thought. She was magnificent in ways that transcended her physical presence, intelligent and fierce, and carrying a strength that made his own determination seem small by comparison. And now she was his sister, untouchable by law and honor, protected by the very act that had created the bond between them. As the sun climbed toward zenith, Annaba found him outside, pretending to work on fence repairs that didn't matter anymore. She stood close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her massive frame, could smell the sage and leather that clung to her clothing. Her words came slowly, carefully chosen in English that carried only slight accent. She spoke of Apache traditions, of the ways that adoption could be reversed if both parties agreed, if circumstances demanded it. She explained that her father was not a man who made decisions without considering all angles, all possible outcomes. The adoption had solved an immediate problem. It had protected Thorn from the marshal and given her father legal grounds to claim jurisdiction. But Cochise was also a father who'd watched his daughters grow into warriors, who knew their hearts and minds better than they knew themselves. The puzzle pieces began shifting, revealing a pattern Thorn hadn't seen because he'd been too focused on individual crises. Annaba's voice dropped lower, intimate despite the open desert around them. She stated that her heart had chosen its own path, that she saw him not as a brother, but as a man worthy of standing beside her, that she would speak this truth to her father when he returned regardless of consequences. The confession hung between them, dangerous and honest, everything they both felt given voice and weight. Itza's recovery brought her outside by evening, still weak but mobile, her massive frame steadier with each passing hour. She observed her sister and Thorn with knowing eyes, reading the tension between them as easily as tracking prey across open ground. When she spoke, her English was more fractured than Annaba's, but her meaning clear. She declared that Annaba had saved her life more times than she could count, had stood against their brother's pride to defend her choice, had chosen honor over easy peace. If Annaba now chose Thorn, Itza would stand with that choice against anyone who challenged it, including their father if necessary. The declaration was both fierce loyalty and subtle warning. The path forward would not be simple, would carry costs they couldn't fully predict, but the choice belonged to Annaba and Annaba alone. Chief Cochise returned as promised, alone except for a single elder who served as witness to whatever judgment was about to unfold. The chief's expression revealed nothing as he approached, though Thorn sensed amusement dancing behind those sharp eyes. The leader who'd outmaneuvered a federal marshal and navigated impossible legal territory now stood before them with the air of a man about to reveal the final card in a carefully played hand. He addressed Annaba first, speaking in Apache with the formal cadence of father to daughter rather than chief to warrior. Though Thorn couldn't understand the words, he watched Annaba's reactions, initial surprise, then growing understanding, finally a fierce joy that transformed her entire bearing. She responded in their shared language, her tone carrying conviction and challenge in equal measure. Whatever her father asked, her answer left no room for doubt or compromise. Cochise turned to Thorn, switching to English with the ease of a diplomat who'd spent decades navigating between cultures. The chief stated that adoption, while powerful, was not irreversible. If both parties agreed, and if circumstances warranted, such bonds could be dissolved through formal ceremony. The words should have brought relief, but Thorn heard the complication hidden beneath them. There was always a cost, always a balance required by tradition and honor. The chief continued, explaining that he'd watched his daughters grow into warriors who made their own choices in battle, who commanded respect through skill and courage, rather than birthright alone. To deny them choice in matters of the heart would betray everything he'd taught them about strength and autonomy. Yet as a father, and as a leader, he had responsibilities to his people, to the complex web of alliances and traditions that held the clan together. His son's wounded pride was not just personal drama, it was a political complication that could fracture carefully maintained unity. The solution Cochise had crafted was characteristically elegant and ruthlessly practical. He would release Thorn from the adoption, dissolving the brother-sister bond that had been created. In its place, he would offer a different path, marriage to Inaba if she would accept, making Thorn's son through union rather than decree. The proposal would satisfy honor, give Inaba her choice, and create a new alliance that strengthened rather than weakened the clan's position. The chief's son would lose face, but lose it to a warrior daughter making her own choice rather than to his father's decree, a subtle but important distinction in clan politics. Thorn's immediate thought was that he had nothing to offer, that the comparison between his failing ranch and the status of a chief's daughter was laughable, but Cochise cut through his objection with sharp precision. The chief noted that Thorn had already proven his value through actions rather than wealth, had demonstrated courage and honor that transcended material possessions. The blood debt was real, the respect earned through choice rather than chance. More importantly, Inaba had already made her decision clear. The question was whether Thorn had the courage to accept what she offered. Inaba stepped forward, her towering presence commanding attention. Her gaze locked on Thorn with an intensity that seemed to strip away every defense and pretense. She spoke her choice in both Apache and English, making certain there could be no misunderstanding. She claimed him as her chosen partner, declared her willingness to bind her life to his, stated that she'd found in him something she'd never found among her own people. A man who saw her as a person rather than a weapon, who'd risked everything for strangers simply because it was right, who stood firm in the face of impossible odds without surrendering his humanity. The words were declaration and challenge, offering and demand, everything that Inaba herself embodied expressed in raw honesty. Thorn's answer came without hesitation or calculation. He accepted, knowing he was choosing a path that would change everything about his life, that would bind him to a people and a culture he barely understood, that would mark him as forever different in the eyes of both Apache and white settlers. But he'd already made that choice when he'd pulled 2 dying women from the dust near his well. Everything since had been momentum carrying him toward this moment. The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything the territory had ever witnessed, a fusion of Apache tradition and frontier pragmatism that created something entirely new. Inaba stood nearly 7 feet tall in her traditional wedding dress, the beadwork and leather transformed into something that blended warrior fierce and feminine grace. The sight of her was magnificent and slightly terrifying. A woman who could break men in half, choosing to bind herself to a rancher, with more determination than resources. The ceremony itself was conducted in both languages, Apache and English flowing together as witness to a union that transcended cultural boundaries. Itza stood as honor witness, her presence a statement of endorsement that silenced potential objections from clan members who might question the match. Chief Cochise's formal blessing carried weight that extended far beyond personal approval. His words carefully crafted to frame the union as strengthening rather than weakening Apache interests. When Thorn placed his hand in Inaba's, the size difference was almost comical, his calloused palm disappearing into hers like a child's. But the grip she returned was gentle despite her strength, careful despite her power, a physical reminder that the strongest warriors knew precisely how to temper their force. The vows they exchanged were simple and honest, stripped of flowery language in favor of direct promises, to stand together, to protect what they built, to face whatever came with courage and partnership. As night fell and the celebration continued, Thorn found himself surrounded by warriors who hours ago he'd have considered enemies, sharing food and stories around fires that pushed back the desert darkness. The transformation was dizzying, the speed at which his life had changed almost impossible to process. 3 days ago, he'd been a failing rancher, slowly dying of loneliness and poverty. Now he was married to an Apache warrior princess, adopted into a clan that commanded respect throughout the territory, positioned at the center of something that felt like the beginning of a new story, rather than the end of an old one. Itza approached as the celebration wound down, her massive form moving with the careful grace of someone still recovering from serious injury. She spoke in halting English, expressing gratitude that went deeper than words could fully convey. She explained that among their people, a woman who refused a powerful suitor faced consequences that could include forced acceptance or permanent exile. Her choice to refuse the chief's son had been brave but potentially catastrophic. What Thorn had done, protecting them without knowing their status or the political implications, had given her back the freedom to choose her own path. The debt could never be fully repaid, but she would spend her life ensuring he never regretted the choice to help two dying strangers. As the camp settled for the night, Thorn and Inaba stood together outside his small cabin, looking out over land that had seemed like a prison just days ago. She spoke softly about the future, about the plans already forming in her strategic mind. The ranch could become a trading post, a neutral ground where Apache and settlers could meet and exchange goods without the tension of military forts or territorial offices. Her presence would guarantee safe passage for traders, while his willingness to bridge cultures would attract those seeking alternatives to conflict. Together, they could build something that served both peoples, that proved cooperation was possible even in the harsh reality of frontier life. The months that followed proved Inaba's vision correct, though the path was more complex than simple optimism could predict. The trading post that grew from Thorn's failing ranch became a symbol throughout the territory, a place where cultural boundaries blurred and practical necessity overcame prejudice. Settlers who'd never spoken directly to Apache found themselves negotiating with Inaba and Itza, discovering that the fearsome warrior women were also sharp traders with comprehensive knowledge of desert resources. Apache families who'd been restricted to reservation lands gained access to tools and goods that improved their quality of life, while Thorn's careful mediation ensured fair prices and honest dealing on both sides. The success wasn't without challenges. There were those on both sides who viewed the arrangement with suspicion or outright hostility. Settlers who saw any cooperation with Apache as betrayal, warriors who viewed Inaba's choice of a white husband as abandoning her heritage. But Chief Cochise's continued support provided political cover, while the tangible benefits of trade gradually won over even skeptical voices. The sight of Inaba and Itza working side by side with their new brother-in-law became familiar enough to lose its shock value, routine replacing sensation as the post established itself as permanent fixture rather than temporary curiosity. A year after the wedding, as spring rains transformed the desert into brief green abundance, Inaba stood with Thorn watching the daily commerce that now flowed through their property. Caravans arrived weekly, traders from as far as California seeking access to Apache-sourced goods and the security of safe passage their connection provided. The small cabin had expanded into a compound, additional structures built to house inventory and accommodate visitors. Itza had taken a role managing security, her presence alone enough to discourage trouble, her growing reputation as fair but uncompromising creating respect that transcended fear. In quiet moments, when the trading was done and the visitors departed, Thorn sometimes reflected on the impossible chain of events that had led to this life. A dying ranch, two wounded strangers, a choice made in seconds that changed everything. The blood debt that had seemed like mysterious Apache tradition revealed itself as something more universal. The recognition that all lives held value, that courage meant acting despite fear, that the strongest bonds were forged through shared struggle rather than easy circumstance. Chief Cochise visited regularly, his presence both blessing and subtle supervision, ensuring the post maintained its delicate balance. During one such visit, as he sat with Thorn watching the sun set over land that had nearly claimed them both, the chief spoke of his original plan with rare candor. He'd known from the moment Nizoni reported the rescue that Thorn represented opportunity, a man who'd proven his character through action rather than words. The adoption had been testing, a way to observe how the rancher would handle pressure and complexity. The marriage offer had been genuine but also strategic, securing an alliance that served multiple purposes. He'd orchestrated events with the precision of a master strategist, giving his daughter the choice she deserved while simultaneously strengthening his clan's position. The revelation should have felt manipulative, But instead, Thorne found himself laughing at the elegant complexity of it all. He'd been moved like a piece on a game board, but toward an outcome that served everyone involved. Cochise's weathered face creased in answering smile, acknowledging the shared understanding. The chief noted that the best strategies were those where all players won, where what appeared as manipulation was actually the careful alignment of genuine interests. As stars emerged in the darkening sky, Anaba joined them, her hand finding thorns with easy familiarity. Her father watched the gesture with satisfaction that transcended political calculation, a father witnessing his daughter's happiness. Before departing, Cochise spoke final words that carried the weight of prophecy and blessing combined. He declared that what they'd built together, this small trading post in the middle of nowhere, represented the future more than any treaty or military campaign. It proved that different peoples could coexist, that strength came in many forms, that the courage to cross boundaries created possibilities that isolation could never achieve. The post would outlast them all, becoming legend in its own right, a place where a humble rancher rescued 2 massive Apache warrior women, and a chief made a stunning call that changed the frontier forever. The story would be told around campfires for generations, growing with each retelling, but the heart would remain true, that sometimes the bravest act was simply choosing to help, and that such choices could reshape the world in ways no amount of force or strategy ever could. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, share with us where you're joining this story from. Leave your comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next adventure.